2006. This was back Reagan was next day, the Senate. But of course, these gains reversed in the midterm elections, which the president's party almost always loses. With the exception, two midterm elections, the last one with Clinton and then the first one with George W. Bush. The president's party gained some seats, not a lot, but some. Since then, it's pretty much gone back to form. So President Biden lost 9 in the House in 2022, though the Democrats did pick up 1 in the Senate. Wait a minute, I'm feeling guilty again. Maybe I should feel this emotion more often. And in 2018, the Republicans under Trump lost 41 in the House, but gained 2 in the Senate. So 2014 was normal. The Democrats lost 13 in the House and 9 in the Senate. So anything else about the president's legislative powers? Let me go then to the president's military powers. That's not referring just to military powers. It was thought to be very important that there be civilian control of the military, especially after our experience with the British. There's been a mixed record of expertise, though, and so George Washington had plenty of military experience when he became president. And when the Whiskey Rebellion happened, he sort of acted as a generalissimo. He got on the uniform, he got on his horse, he reviewed the troops, he rode a little way with them before turning over control to someone else. The opposite, which I may have mentioned already this year, was James Madison in the War of 1812, with practically 0 military experience. But he thought maybe the president should lead the troops in battle, especially if the battle is happening near Washington, D.C. Fortunately, he was talked out of that before it was too late. During the Mexican-American War, we had concerns about political partisanship. President Polk was a Democrat, but his top generals all seemed to be Whigs. It was Zachary Taylor. It was uncertain what his political leanings were because he'd never voted for president in his life. He'd been in the military, stationed in various posts most of the time. But it was suspected he was a Whig, so after he had initial success in the war, Polk gave orders to halt his offensive and instead gave more resources to Winfield Scott, who commanded the drive on Mexico City. And that was successful, and it turned out Polk was right. Both men would run for the presidency, both as Whigs. But during the war, some of his decisions may have been shaded by not wanting to make a Whig too popular. So there's that concern as well. In the Civil War, we had another rookie, Abraham Lincoln. He served for 50 days in the Illinois State Militia during the Black Hawk War in Illinois, saw no combat. So when the Civil War was starting, he was cramming for military textbooks and usually took the advice of his top commanders who had far more experience. As the war went on, he gained more confidence in his military judgments and would increasingly know what he wanted and look for the commanders who would give it to him. In the 20th century, the modern commander-in-chiefs come about. The president is involved with overall strategy, but usually implementation and field decisions are left to the military professionals, how to carry out that strategy. But not always. And so Lyndon Johnson, for example, met with top military officials, often over lunch, to pick out bombing targets in North Vietnam. So they always had that ability to get involved at a more detailed level if they want to.
Peyton,
Yeah.
to what extent would, so like, if they're like the commander in chief, do they like have to listen to the president? So if the president, like, you know, LBJ says, we're bombing this city, but I don't remember who the general at the time of Vietnam said thinks that's a bad idea, who kind of has the call? Does the president?
You're the commander in chief for a reason. If you want to be in charge, you're in charge. Now, along with that, though, comes responsibility. So if you make bad decisions, then you'll be accountable for it too. Of course, the biggest strategic decision the president's ever made was Truman and the atomic bomb. And this points out that the factors the president operates under when he's making a decision may not be the same factors he's evaluated by. And so for Truman, as he put it, this was simply a war decision. If we could end the war faster, save lives, essentially, by not having to invade Japan after the terrible invasions of many small islands in the Pacific, then he was all for it. Gave the warning when Japan didn't surrender, ordered them to be used. The evaluation of that decision has happened in a number of contexts since. At first, it was pretty much the war mentality, but then the Cold War mentality came about, and that's when it became more popular to say that Truman dropped the bomb not as the last weapons against Japan, but as the first weapons against the Soviets. To inspire the Soviets with a healthy respect for our military strength. And then, in a number of ways since then. I used to say similar things about Vietnam, just about every major conflict. Of course, wherever the president goes, the football goes with him, the briefcase with the nuclear launch codes. And so right there is a pretty stark reminder of this responsibility. The most controversial thing has been using troops without a declaration of war. One of FDR's cabinet officials said before World War II, the Constitution has not greatly bothered any wartime president. Well, he hasn't seen anything yet. What's the last war Congress has declared?
World War II.
World War II. For some reason, after World War II, we fell out of the habit. The first reason was the new situation after the war. So what did Harry Truman call Korea?
A police measure.
It's too close.
The United Nations police measure thing.
You're nothing better than thinking. That's what got him. United Nations police action. Truman's hope was that the United Nations could become what the League of Nations never had been. A credible force for upholding certain principles in the world. So instead of calling on Congress to declare war on North Korea, Truman worked through the United Nations, and that was maybe an unusual situation. Vietnam, Congress never declared war. A more gradual escalation. What's the closest to a declaration of war in Vietnam?
Oh, it's the act they passed after the Tonkin.
Which one was it?
Go for Tonkin resolution. Go for Tonkin resolution.
Okay, close enough.
Tonkin Gulf resolution?
That's the and that came in a certain circumstance when it looked like the North Vietnamese were escalating by attacking U.S. destroyers in the Tonkin Gulf. We thought our destroyers had been attacked twice. Upon further review, they were attacked just once. But in the situation, it looked like an escalation by the North Vietnamese. The president had no authorization to retaliate. So we asked Congress for this resolution that would allow them to strike back if we did that. And in these circumstances, Congress approved it almost unanimously. Only 2 senators were opposed, and both of them lost the election not long afterwards. But that authorized Johnson to do the escalation that came later. So the bombing of Operation Rolling Thunder, and then troops to defend the air bases, and then more troops to better defend, and then just troops doing operations. So that was a gradual escalation of power, but many armed interventions since, none of them have had declarations of war. The strangest one was when the United States declared war on Afghanistan and again Iraq after 9/11, Congress passed resolutions of support for military action. Now, what's the difference between a resolution of support and a declaration of war?
The name?
Well, the resolution of support isn't legally binding, it just says the president should do something.
Go, President! Yeah, that's probably it. It doesn't carry as much oomph. You wonder if you're going to go that far, why not go the last step and declare war? It's hard to say, except we seem to have fallen out of the habit. Well, it was Nixon who was perceived as using the war powers too much, who got the backlash. Where did he use his war powers too much?
Cambodia.
And
Laos.
That was a lousy answer.
No minus points? Yeah.
Okay, I'll cancel out your points. What's the answer?
What?
Just say yes.
I thought that was a motion of outrage.
It was a motion of like, oh yeah, no negative points.
I agree.
So Congress, as part of the backlash against what they felt was the imperial presidency at the time, passed the War Powers Act of 1973, which sort of legalized what presidents have been doing. So according to the act, the president can use the military for 60 days, 90 days in some circumstances, unless Congress terminates their use of it. It seemed good in theory. In practice, it's been fairly useless because once the troops are out in the field, Congress will look like they're anti-troop or unpatriotic if they cancel the point. So
What
it's never,
happens after 60 days?
then the president can keep driving.
Also,
Well,
60 days to cancel the deployment, or does the president just get to keep the troops out there?
In theory, he's supposed to end the operation without congressional approval. In practice, that really doesn't happen, for the reasons that I said.
The president just keeps illegally sending troops out after 60 days, and no one gets him in trouble?
Again, I quote Nixon, if the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, now I'm quoting the Supreme Court, although not in those exact words. If the president does it as part of his presidential responsibilities, it is not punishable. So the War Powers Act hasn't had an appreciable effect in limiting the president's ability to use the military without declaration of war. What often does, though, limit the president's war powers is public opinion. And so in the Iraq War, we got the resolution support in 2003. And then, as that deployment went on, as tends to happen in representative governments, opposition to it grew the longer the war lasted. The Democrats took control of Congress in 2007, and they argued that President Bush had support from Congress's resolution for the original invasion of Iraq, but not the 5 years of war afterwards, or the 4 years of war afterwards. And so the Democrats tried to put a cap on force levels and establish a timetable for withdrawal, but since they didn't have a veto-proof majority, they couldn't make those things stick. And the president, of course, claimed that these attempts by Democrats to limit his war powers were a violation of his position as commander-in-chief. The other thing Congress has is the power of the purse. But generally, this was seen as political suicide to cut funding for troops in the field. So, the president's war-making powers continue to be murky. Any other questions on those? Have we been through all the powers of the president yet? You think the president at this point should have fewer powers?
Yes.
I mean, is that specifically so this lecture will end?
No.
The president is also the chief diplomat. In this area, he has vast authority, vaster than in domestic policy. A lot of domestic policy he has to do in combination with Congress. Here he has much more control. And part of this is expressed, but part of it is just inherent in the presidency. And then keep in mind that while Congress goes in and out of session, America is always in session, meaning that foreign policy perpetually needs to be operated. And so that's another reason why it resides with the executive branch instead of with the legislative branch primarily. So as part of this, there's the treaty-making power with advice and consent to the Senate. Treaties have the same force as law, and the latest treaty, like the latest law, is the one that's considered to be in effect if there's a conflict. Technically, the Senate approves treaties, but doesn't ratify, even though we use that language a lot. And the president can withdraw a treaty from the Senate. And so Woodrow Wilson, for example, withdrew the Treaty of Versailles. In the end, he wouldn't accept it with the amendments that had been offered to it. The Senate voted down a nuclear test ban treaty in 1999 due to problems with verification. And that was the first time a treaty had been rejected since the Treaty of Versailles. Just like presidents sometimes choose how they're going to enforce laws, they sometimes choose how they're going to enforce treaties. And so they might emphasize some things over others. What is the foreign policy equivalent of an executive order?
Executive decision.
I wish it were. Foreign policy equivalent of an executive order. That's an executive agreement. And in just about every way, it's similar. Just like an executive order should be pursuant to a law that's been passed, an executive agreement should be pursuant to a treaty that's been passed, but each should deal with some of the details so that they can be carried out more fully. And these these are, there have been a lot of these. We've had about 1,400 treaties and 9,000 executive agreements. When necessary, they can be speedy and even secret. So when Teddy Roosevelt took over the customs collection of the Dominican Republic in 1905, that happened fairly quickly, and was the basis for what foreign policy pronouncement?
Big stick?
It was an example of a big stick.
Big brother.
Roosevelt corollary?
The Roosevelt corollary. If the Monroe Doctrine says Europe, stay out of the Americas, the Roosevelt corollary says if you've got any problems in the Americas, handle them through the United States. What crucial executive agreement did FDR make before we entered World War II? Oh, that was Hitler and stuff.
Was it chips for money? Chips for money?
Lend
Chips,
lease?
That was a law. We had the money for that one.
chips for money.
Didn't they lend money to the British?
Yeah.
Boats for, no,
Bases.
ships for bases.
Base.
That'll work. Destroyers for bases. So we wanted to help the British. Congress had already passed changes to cash and carry, or to the Neutrality Act, so that we could sell things to the British as long as they got them in their own ships and paid money for them. But they were running out of ships, especially warships for escort. And this was as far as Roosevelt felt he could go on his own authority, to swap 50 old destroyers in return for leases on British naval bases in the Americas. And at least that way, Roosevelt could claim he was strengthening hemispheric defense instead of provoking war. People knew he was kind of doing that too. Another part of the president's role as chief diplomat is establishment of diplomatic relations with power of recognition. And this is another inherent power of the presidency. You can decide with which countries we're going to have formal relations. And sometimes this is used as a strong policy tool, such as Teddy Roosevelt deciding to almost immediately recognize which new nation?
Israel.
Teddy Roosevelt?
Cuba.
Let's go. So we could get that canal done. But sometimes it's difficult or even embarrassing. The United States did not recognize Haiti until the Civil War, even though it claimed to be a nation for almost 60 years by that point, because of the complicating factor of slavery. And so many U.S. presidents early on were either Southerners or Southern sympathizers. The Soviet Union claimed it came into existence in 1917, 1918 at the latest. The United States didn't recognize the Soviet Union until 1933. Similarly, the U.S. didn't recognize Communist China until 1979. 30 years after the communists took power. And then there are smaller difficulties. First George Bush had to figure out when to recognize, say, Lithuania as an independent country. It claimed to be one in 1990, and the U.S. had never recognized Soviet control of Lithuania after World War II. But the Soviet Union was still intact. And so should President Bush stand up vigorously for the principles the United States says it represents, in which case he would recognize it, but that would also antagonize the Soviet Union. So President Bush moved cautiously. He gave moral support, but withheld official recognition until it was safer to do so. And then the Soviets obligingly fell apart. And it was no longer a problem. Well, there have been various situations like this on the borders of many countries, various places in Russia, or sometimes in Africa, where areas claim independence, and we have to decide if we're going to recognize it or not. And then there's the power to receive or not receive foreign diplomats. What's the most famous case of rejection? It came early.
John Jay.
Nope, we sent him out. But someone in another country sent out that we did not receive as an ambassador.
Was it the French ambassador?
British. He was French.
Lafayette.
No. Citizen.
Kane.
What we wish. Citizen Genet was his name. G-E-N-E-T. And the problem with him was, by this time, the radical French Revolution was well underway. And Genet was not only acting as an ambassador, but he was touring major cities of the United States trying to drum up support for the French Revolution, which was not very diplomatic of him. And so Washington refused to recognize him. Genet should have gone back to France, but understanding something of the nature of the radical revolution, he decided to stay in the United States as a private citizen.
What a stud.
It was probably a wise choice. Well, the last few go quicker. The president is also the chief of state, also known as the chief citizen. And so in that way, he's the closest thing, except for Uncle Sam, that we have for a representative of the nation. This is an inherent power. Yes, sir. Symbol of the country. President Taft said the president represents the dignity and majesty of the American people. Think of those words as you look at all those faces. Dignity and majesty. That would be nice. And again, I guess the American people has to be dignified and majestic.
Well, I wouldn't
We'll take
know
it
if,
for class.
I wouldn't call Taft majestic. So
Who? Taft.
He was a little bit of a big boy.
Taft is kind of majestic. Look at that mustache.
Did you touch the plushie?
You know, if Franklin Pierce had a better hairline,
Ah, you did move it. You did move it.
if he had a better hairline, if he had a better hairline,
Where is this?
hey, better get your wave down.
For those of you who are asking this question, I think you're on a don't need to know basis.
Is it a location
Those
joke?
of you who need to know
The eternal
what's
planet.
going
Or
on.
the
Mr. Carpenter,
Kim
is it a
Jong-un wave?
location joke? You had to be there?
How does Kim Jong-un look? I don't remember. He's like,
You have to know something.
stop.
It's a no joke.
President should not wave.
They
They
should
should
not.
stand and everyone should bow.
Do this. Should I start doing the stalling?
This is different from many other nations. A lot of places will have a chief of state who's separate from the chief executive or chief legislator. And so, for example, the biggest example is England. It used to be so much easier with Queen Elizabeth II. You have the Prime Minister, and he's the one who has to worry about passing laws through Parliament. What does Queen have to do? Nothing.
She had to sit there and look pretty.
All right, it's symbol. President, it's symbolic.
I admire how well she did that for such a long time. She even received Paddington the Bear. Yeah. On the residence. So in other words, in some ways that's easier to symbolize the nation without having to get involved in the political fighting that's going on in the nation. It's harder enough for majesty particularly when you're getting down and dirty. When battles you're having.
That's funny.
So the president has to do it all.
Kill those Ukrainians. Kill those Ukrainians.
Except those who try to separate it, like, maybe Reagan, if he did not successfully. This is why the president does all those ceremonial things, decorating war heroes, sometimes throwing out the first ball of baseball games, dedicating parks and post offices, these days, receiving the champions of whatever sport. Still wants to go to the White House. Distinguished visitors, guests from other nations. And in a larger sense, leader of the free world. This used to go along with this, I'm not sure if it still does. The president is also chief guardian of the economy. I mentioned before this didn't used to be the case, but definitely by 1946 it was with the Employment Act, permitting the executive to look for full employment. I guess not surprisingly, coming so soon after the Great Depression. And presidents are often held accountable for how the economy is doing when they're up for re-election. The president, even though parties aren't even in the Constitution, is the leader of his party. And expects a certain amount of loyalty from party members, whether that's loyalty to the party's principle or loyalty to the president himself, varies with the president. In one word, what is his main tool for enforcing this?
His voice. That's two words. Voice.
The word is
And
patronage.
I said that. I actually did.
she
say
did
that.
say that. She did say. I heard it.
I just said it really quiet.
Wait a minute, you're on her team. Is anyone not on her team who is
I
really?
just said it really quiet.
I heard it.
No way. That's two. That's two.
I heard it. I'll be nice. I'll be nice. I believe her. I believe her.
I believe Anna Hyatt, but I did not hear her.
I believe her.
I believe as well.
As long as she's a disciple of Christ.
Did you, in fact, touch the plushie?
No, because I don't know what the push is.
That doesn't mean you didn't touch it.
I didn't.
You might have just unintentionally bumped into it. I don't know where it is because he moved it.
Ooh. Carpenter's mad.
Carpenter's getting heated.
That's the most mad I've ever seen Mr. Carpenter.
Fight, 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 fight.
You have representation at this point.
No, we don't get it till like January. It's stupid.
Take a note. Take a note.
You know, most
Remember.
This could be
patronage or civil service, the top level is patronage. And as you've seen, our incoming president seems to emphasize not just party loyalty, but personal loyalty in his appointments, as we'll see in a few minutes when we get to what's been happening lately. But it also goes both ways. In some ways, the president is expected to help how he can candidates for the party. And it's certainly in his interest to have a strong majority for his party, and so often he does this with it. It can be tense when the president and other significant party leaders are from different wings of the party. And we've seen this recently.
But don't do anything before I'm president.
President Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He's now on his way out. See eye to eye on a number of things. Yeah, that can happen. No, I think that's it. Hours of the presidency that we're still ricocheting around out there. And what's been going on lately that I know about? Start east this time, we head west.
Joe Biden pardoned his son. I think it's not, is it Hunter?
Hunter.
Yeah, Hunter Biden. And then people are kind of upset about
It's
that.
on.
Well,
under
starting at the top,
anesthesia,
why did
so he's
President
not
Biden
the
say he
president.
pardoned his
He's
sons? I think he said many times he was not going to get involved.
I didn't see much of it, I just heard about it.
Anyone know why the president said he pardoned his son?
Richard?
Yeah.
He said something about like the politicization of his issue and how he's like sober for like 5.5 years and he's just kind of working hard.
Is there any evidence that his case was politicized or unusual?
How big a deal would it be?
Every like anti-Biden person has used Hunter Biden's involvement with like Ukraine, and I just him himself as a criminal being still in touch with his father who was the president. They kind of use that as a way to say that Joe Biden is also a corrupt and
So he's definitely in an unusual situation compared to other people charged with these crimes. Anything else? Any other evidence? As I understand it, and I haven't followed it as closely as I thought, or as I probably should have, it looked like he was gonna get a plea deal. My impression at the time was this is generally how these cases go. But then there was an outburst from Republicans saying he's just getting this treatment because he's the president's son, so then the plea deal was taken back. And instead he was sent to trial and was convicted and is now awaiting sentencing. So I don't know enough about the law to know how much weight that should carry. Other thoughts about the issue? My advice to you, and it's not very easy advice, is whenever you hear any politician say certain crucial terms like weaponization, that you brush that aside for the political jargon that it is and look at the facts, which of course is not easy to do because they get pretty detailed and meticulous. Because in our legal system, that's what's supposed to matter, not political slogans. And I've heard this term loud both ways pretty repeatedly, more than I ever have before. If we care about justice, it's not the labels, it's the facts of the case that should matter. And that would involve some research. Anything else going on we should know about? Oh, I guess the other things that are unusual about this is he didn't wait until the last day in office, which many presidents do for their controversial pardons. And he put a certain date limit. Anything he did from a certain date in 2014 to a certain date in 2024 is what he's pardoned from, so he has no free pass from here on out. Maybe that's his way of saying, stay sober, Hunter.
Son,
What else is going on?
stop smoking the crack.
Political.
We don't know.
Trump like appointed new head of the FBI, but I don't really know how much
He has a very exciting name.
Cash
Patel.
Like Cash Grow.
So, Cash Patel.
Student body president.
Any thoughts about the FBI appointee? We've heard about a number of appointees now. How do you think this appointee feels about President-elect Trump?
My favorite.
He is a strong Trump loyalist and has been for some time. No other thoughts?
They're probably the best on it.
Yeah.
This is one of the most controversial appointments so far because the director of the FBI gets 10 years, although the
So he gets
president can't remove him.
fired.
The current director was appointed by President Trump in his first term, Christopher Wray, and he's been in for 7 years. And the president and the former president hasn't always been delighted with his running of the FBI. So now, if Wray doesn't resign, Trump will fire him and put in Patel instead.
You're fired. You're fired.
This is especially controversial with the FBI. Well, not always. For a long time, J. Edgar Hoover was in charge, and he used whatever his agency picked up for his own purposes. But as part of the backlash against J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI was professionalized. That's why he's given a 10-year term. And some directors have served for presidents from both parties. Usually, they're able to serve their full 10 years unless there's some corruption, mismanagement. In this case, the removal, it looks like, would be almost entirely personal. I don't like this person, seemingly because he's not loyal enough, so I'm going to put in someone who's more loyal as the head of a law enforcement agency. See, that's what makes this one particularly controversial. And we'll probably hear some things about confirmation hearings about this. The suspicion, and it's not just a suspicion because of what the former president has said, is that he wants payback against his enemies. This appointment does not weaken that conclusion, but we won't know until specific actions are taken. Anything else going on?
Adam, a bill has been introduced with wide bipartisan support to create a new national park in Georgia.
What will this park be called?
Off Multi Mounds or something. I'm not sure how to pronounce the first word.
No, I've never heard of it until this moment.
It's for tourism. It was used for tourism.
But what is the attraction of this mound?
They're mounds. They have historical
And
significance.
are these Native American burial mounds that have relics inside, or are they interesting looking natural features?
They're Native American mounds.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, what is this place called?
It's OCMULTPE. Right now it's a national, and then, yeah, mounds. And right now it's a national historic site, and they're gonna make it a national park.
Oh, okay. Well, it's nice when you get strong bipartisan support for that. It's more significant than national chocolate licorice day.
I think that's not.
There's no licorice in it. This is just a collection.
Okay, that's.
Let's see. Oh, yeah, the other interesting appointee is, the Secretary of Agriculture, the one that, President-elect Trump has nominated, or he suggested he's gonna nominate, is not an ally of RFK Jr., which is important because RFK Jr. says he wants to overhaul how the government, deals with food and with farmers. Well, the Department of Agriculture not only sets agricultural policy, but it's also over the USDA, which handles a lot of food regulations. And so not having an ally there would significantly limit what RFK Jr. would be able to do, even though he might be in charge of services. So that says something about the relationship between those two. You might be thinking at this point, boy, the president has a lot of power. Is there anything to limit the president's power? And the answer, I'm happy to tell you, is yes.
What were we gonna say?
Certain limits are, well, they're in different categories. And so, here's one of those. Of course, there are constitutional limits, such as the various checks and balances, the separation of powers. And keep in mind, the different elections in the Constitution set up different constituencies for public officials. So representatives have to be reelected every 2 years. They're always running for re-election, and the president knows that and can sometimes use that. The president has 4 years, senators have 6. Also, different ways of looking at things come with these different offices. I've said it before this year, but the famous phrase is where you stand depends on where you sit. So Lyndon Johnson, as majority leader of the Senate, was much more conservative on civil rights issues than he was as president, where he became an all-out champion for the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Because he had a different constituency now. He was president of the United States. He had different political and term considerations after getting re-elected. Well, he could get re-elected, but he was already in the top position of the land and was looking at a different set of facts, really, than he had been as a senator. What should this country be instead of what can I get passed? These different rhythms often have a big impact. George Bush the first said, the way to slow down old age is to move it through Congress. And career congressmen can often outlast limited presidents, especially if they've risen to become chairman of committees in Congress, where they can bottle up legislation or fast track it if they want to. Another factor here is our now constitutional term limit. The presidents get only 2 terms in office, unless they take over from someone else, then they can get up to 10 years. Not everyone thought that Washington's precedent was a good idea. And it's one of the reasons why they didn't establish formal term limits in the original Constitution. Hamilton wrote in Federalist 72 that former presidents might endanger the peace of the community or the stability of the government, especially if you have, say, a half dozen ex-presidents wandering among the people like discontented ghosts and sighing for a place which they were destined never more to possess. Maybe we should have worried more about sitting vice presidents than former presidents. So because of the setup, power often tends to flow back and forth between the president and Congress. Sometimes Congress seems preeminent, sometimes the president when it comes to actually getting things done. I've mentioned many times the laws Congress passed after Nixon, some of which were more successful than others. But in general, in the late 70s, under Ford and Carter, the presidency was pretty weak, and Congress seemed to have the upper hand. And then Reagan grabbed more power for the presidency and on another cycle. The second big limit, political parties. We've seen many times the effect of divided government, and we've had divided government for more than half the time since World War II. But another aspect of political parties that limits presidents is the decentralized nature of party power. Just because the president is the head of the party doesn't mean that everyone, from the vice president down to the local caucus chair, snaps to attention when the president says he wants something done. Even members of Congress can often defy the president, even if they're from the same party, and the same is true for state and local leaders as well. The third limit, the media. Nixon, what are you doing there? I forgot why he's in that particular spot. Maybe that's one. What's the nickname for the round-the-clock coverage of the president?
The space coverage?
Death Watch, which is kind of morbid. What it means, with so many people watching your every move almost, you're bound to make mistakes. And those mistakes can accumulate. Sometimes they're unintended mistakes. Reagan once blasted the media after a press conference, unaware that a live mic picked it all up. Same thing happened to the second George Bush, and Vice President Cheney made a derogatory comment about a specific New York Times reporter, which was picked up on a microphone. Another way in which media limits presidents is they often feel the need to give equal coverage to positions opposed to the president. And so when presidents speak strongly on something, that means their opponents get airtime as well. One nice thing for the president is often there are battles for credit when it comes to accomplishments in government. The president as one figure usually wins out over members of Congress, which is more group motivated. As we've seen a little earlier, there's the 24-hour news coverage. This relationship became all-out war during the Trump presidency. Now, the usual pattern is that politicians will say generally nice things about the press and how important freedom of the press is until the freedom of the press says something negative about them, in which case they have less complimentary things to say. But many times, President Trump has dealt with the media as enemies, not just of him, but of the country. And when the media says something about him he doesn't like, what is it?
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news.
Fake news.
I think that's
You're
a
fake
clear
news.
attack on me. So that's implying the whole system is corrupt.
You're fake news.
Fake news.
Once again, whenever you hear
MSS,
labels like
MSNBC
that,
has to be jailed.
your job as a citizen is to understand why the label's being used. Let's go political level here. And then look into the specifics of the allegation. Reason through what's going on, see what was actually said, see what's accurate, what's inaccurate. But that takes attention and work. But that's one of the reasons why we get the kind of government we deserve. If we never penetrate beyond the labels, then we'll really get the kind of government we deserve. Another interesting element lately is, especially in this last election, social media, podcasts. Joe Rogan,
Call her daddy.
It's a podcast.
Kamala went on it.
Very instrumental.
She's spent 6 figures living a sad. 6 figures.
Another limiting factor on the presidency is attitudes towards the president. While we want a leader, we generally don't want a dictator. And so Americans are patriotic but also individualistic and be suspicious of even popular presidents who they think go too far. FDR is the big example. Another limit is the bureaucracy. It is very large and very slow. Just like there are competing special interests on every issue, there are often competing bureaucracies on certain issues, at least until Elon Musk gets a hold of them. In which case, the ones that are opposed to his business interests will be eliminated. That's pretty simple. We'll have to wait and see. And so as a president, you have to decide which bureaucracies, which agencies you're going to rely on and trust the most. Which ones might be your allies, and which ones might be opposed to you. But in any event, there's significant inertia. It's hard to move the bureaucracy, especially in a direction it doesn't want to go. So all presidents have faced this. President Trump, again, is taking this to a high level. What's his slogan for this?
Rain the swamp.
Rain the swamp. Is what he calls it. And we'll see, towards the end of his first term, he was moving to weaken the protections on civil service bureaucrats to make them more easily dismissible. than before, seemingly to get the bureaucracy to bend in the direction he wants them to. We'll see how much he picks up. He wasn't really able to carry them out since they came towards the end of his presidency. We'll see how much he picks it up in the new term. But here's how certain people would put it. An advisor to FDR said half of the president's suggestions, which theoretically carry the weight of orders, can be safely forgotten by a cabinet member. Or Harry S. Truman, contemplating Eisenhower's upcoming presidency, particularly since Eisenhower was a retired general used to having his orders obeyed instantly. He'll sit here in the White House and they'll say, do this, do that, and nothing will happen. Another limiting factor on presidents is foreign affairs, because they're unpredictable. Wars break out, hostages get taken, the Israelis and Palestinians won't agree to peace. Oh wait, I think that's pretty. But you never know what might happen. And as, say, Woodrow Wilson and Lyndon Johnson have found out, you can be supremely well prepared as a president for domestic policy, but your presidency might end up being engulfed in foreign policy. And finally, there is public opinion. There are short-term and long-term versions of this. In the short term, you have polls and approval ratings. Let me look at this one. As far as the polls go, but here are the approval ratings.
Obama.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get the updates.
What's that
Obama.
big spike partway through H.W. Bush's presidency?
When he said he wouldn't raise taxes and then he did.
Well, that was during the campaign.
That's the Persian Gulf War. Oh, that's,
I didn't know.
I wonder why Nixon was so low.
any
Truman, what
pattern
happened to
of
Truman, bro?
The approval ratings
They ended
go
lower
down.
than they started.
So
What the heck
what's the
happened
name
to
of this? This is the honeymoon period, is what it's called.
Wait, why did Clinton's overall approval ratings go up from the beginning?
Because Clinton was the second president to get which nickname? First was Reagan. Both of them have been called the Teflon president. Scandals did not stick. So you get your honeymoon period for the first year. Lyndon Johnson, when he became president after JFK's assassination, really rode his aides and cabinet officials hard to get legislation through, because he said, and he knew from his time in the Senate, you've got only a couple months when they treat you well, so you've got to get it done now. Well, I say you've got 1 year when they treat you right, and before they start worrying about themselves again. That's probably important.
Do you have a graph count for Biden's approval ratings?
Yeah, my suspicion is they're more like most of them rather than like Reagan's or Clinton's or Eisenhower's.
Biden's been really, really bad. But Trump's also been
There are a number of reasons though why approval ratings drop off. One of them, of course, is just the expectation gap. You make so many promises in your campaign, you can fulfill so few of them when you're elected. Secondly, things that go wrong get blamed on the president, even when they're not his fault. Third, more time for bad events to pile up. Whether it's scandals or undesirable foreign events. Fourth, press criticism accumulates. And fifth, towards the end, lame duckness. When it's obvious that your time's almost up, so people don't have to listen to you so much anymore. And that's never good.
Hey, Joe Biden, pardon us to get attention.
Adam,
Yeah.
considering that approval ratings go down for sitting presidents, how come there's such a strong incumbency effect? Because wouldn't the fact that their approval ratings are lower than someone who just makes a bunch of promises and hasn't been president, shouldn't that give them like an anti-incumbent effect? Like a rank of divided?
You have to look at each one, to see how they made it through. Somehow they did, but, even if they got reelected by big numbers, say Reagan, the second term often is not much to it. He got Iran-Contra in the second term to deal with. Bill Clinton, elected pretty comfortably, got a whole series of,
Did not have sexual relations with that woman. Richard Flint. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
So he goes to the second George Bush. Oh, that doesn't have the whole picture.
That's cool.
Highs and lows.
I wonder why George W. Bush was
Yeah, well, he got it all. He got the end of the Cold War, the very successful first Persian Gulf War, and then the economy went into recession. So he did not even get reelected. It's just a couple months before the election. And it's still in one. It's pretty much overseen.
Go back to those gas prices. Ooh. That's actually way crazy.
That's funny.
Oh, no, that's presidential approval.
No, but on
Compared
the
to
other
gas
side, it's
prices.
50 cents for the green. Gas prices, real.
Where does it get 250 cents?
It
It
doesn't.
doesn't. Gas prices is great. It gets to like $1.
It's crazy.
That's good.
Gotta be some.
I would approve of Joe
$80
Biden
to
if it went to $1.50.
I think it's $0, guys.
Wait, why did it in like 2011?
$0. No, it could be $1.50 if you just, drilled more oil in this country.
10 times as much. You drill so much oil.
So,
it's not
there's
fucking
the
real
all
oil.
with approved president.
$0 gas.
I like how you think. It's simple gas.
Gas prices here are just a shorthand for.
$4.50.
More often than not.
Are we in the 290s again?
Yeah.
The majority of
You
it?
serious, man?
This is awesome sauce, guys.
Probably like $6
No,
in
it's
California.
It's $5 on the way there.
So it's
so-
only for the first little bit, the first 15 months.
Didn't know Uncle Sam sang that way.
So that's the short term. In the medium term, there are elections, whether it's the midterms or your reelection as president. In the long term, presidential rankings. Another sign of how the president is the focus of leadership is how often they're ranked, especially in recent decades. This isn't something that usually happens to speakers of the House or majority leaders of the Senate or even chief justices of the Supreme Court. But presidents, yes. So starting especially in the early 60s, historians started ranking presidents seriously, and then more and more polls were taken of the general public. Here's one attempt from, I think, the 1990s or so, so recent presidents aren't there, but it's up here because of how systematic it is. It tries to break presidential leadership
Whoa.
into different categories. So, leadership, accomplishments, political skill, appointments, and character.
Hey, cut Willie Harrison some slack. He was there for a month.
Just don't even put on. He's in.
Put his accomplishments out there.
Richard Nixon, the first
So
president
you
from
see
Johnson.
Richard Nixon's character rating isn't very high.
That's
Who
BS.
is the biggest one?
But his accomplishments though.
I wonder why Harrison's accomplishments are so low.
I'm surprised they're so high on Kennedy. That's like
They should. Why is FDR above George Washington? Kind of pisses me off.
John Kennedy above Harrison. Straight to the bottom.
But now there are so many.
Crazy.
of them
Joke's
that
crazy.
They're aggregated.
Bro,
So.
President
JFK, top 10.
Very
that's BS. That is BS. I will say. That's BS.
Wilson at 7.
Jefferson is not that good.
Woodrow Wilson, he should be like 47.
I'm not very happy that Wilson got so high.
Yeah.
How long? How old is this?
Or FDR.
JFK should be top
That's like
10.
ranking Arizona State.
JFK is down.
They're a bad
Arizona
team.
State is not a bad team.
Are you a BYU fan?
The
No.
general public's average.
Yeah, Kennedy.
Bro, what is?
That's just like the coaches.
Get Kennedy out of the top, bro. Kennedy is not top 3 president.
I put Wilson up there.
George Washington is better.
JFK, bro.
Why is JFK in the top 3?
JFK is like decent.
He's not top. He's not top.
He's like, I think he's like 25th. Middle of the pack.
No, he's like 40.
What if he didn't do anything that bad? He had like,
No, he did anything
It's
bad.
iconic.
Eek. Berlin.
hey, I'm just saying, if we're bringing looks into this, it makes more sense. Lincoln's an attractive looking fella. Kennedy,
Look at those cheekbones.
George Bush, Clinton.
Reagan. Reagan's a cutie.
Clinton could be like number 1 if we go just based on looks.
No.
Hey, back in his day.
No.
Back in Clinton's prime, he was a good looking dude.
Have you seen Joe Biden in his prime?
Joe Biden in his
Joe Biden in his
prime?
prime?
Okay, well, we're talking about when they were presidents.
Joe Biden's still not a bad looking dude.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, he is.
I'm not surprised you have
Franklin Pierce is a cutie.
the reactions you have.
Franklin Pierce is a cutie.
Wilson
How is that?
Give me just a little zest.
Tell me in our waiting minutes.
Yes.
Why did
A little bit.
You know, it's like, he said
Thing
his son
goes
got
up
run over in a
for
train.
President's Act. They'll try to emulate
Zesty
like the
too.
popular presidents or you know,
If he had-
depressed his whole
you know how much
presidency.
Trump has
If he
said
had a-
about like Lincoln? Or like how the Republicans were like
I think he's number 1 if he had a better
Lincoln's
hair.
Republican and he's everything
Pierce.
Lincoln. But you know,
Two way
the
from him.
Republicans don't talk about Nixon very much.
I don't see why not.
I talk about
This is an important point because it's one way.
I talk about
in
Nixon
which
all the time.
presidential rankings
Garfield's kind of a
affect
cutie,
current
low key.
presidents, Especially as they get.
Look at that
into
smooth
their
bald
second
head.
term.
Grand.
They tend to think more heavily about not pressing current needs, but how am I going
Calvin
to be
Coolidge.
remembered?
John Tyler.
How is my presidency going to be described
John
50,
Tyler.
100 years from now?
Polk's got a
My
kind of
presidency
mullet rocking.
was going to be.
I want to be the
And
first
it
president.
takes different presidents at different levels, but that can be a powerful motivation. And it has been for some. Many other reasons why this matters, or why it doesn't matter.
It's fun.
Fun. How fun?
I don't know.
It's just fun to gossip.
Yeah, that's right.
Reagan's
Talk about other people.
Reagan in his prime?
You're a gossiper?
Hey, Gavin. Have you seen Reagan in his prime?
Rankings is something
That's a cute guy.
I guess any of the presidents. Really good president. I get kids.
Well, like influences are other
It's
things.
called Pure Success. You know LBJ.
You'd kiss LBJ.
I kiss him.
LBJ. Yo, LBJ didn't have his meeting.
In some ways, these rankings.
I said, does Ho Chi Minh have a like this?
Jumbo.
Well, let's see, I believe for next time, you need to
first said the whole name.
16, if you haven't already, you need to, do that sign over form. And based on what you did in 16. And then, you're heading into foreign policy.
Oh, oh.
17.
Hey, you're not 18 yet.
Another vast area of residential responsibility.
Yeah.